Yeah.
Iran, I want to talk a little bit about Iran. So
Well, we got to talk a lot about Iran. I think there's no way you can talk about Syria without talking a lot about Iran.
yeah, Iran, they got involved very early on. So they were the first, uh, they got involved before the Russians even. They sent in a lot of military advisors, is what they called them.
Mhm.
The reasoning was that the official reasoning was that there are Shia holy sites in Syria that they claimed were being threatened or were going to be destroyed um, by radical militia groups who are Sunni. So think Al Qaeda type groups,
Yeah.
related groups, Salafi groups, whatever, that would go and blow up Shia shrines. So
Which
that was
was,
their.
I mean, it was a real possibility. It
It
was
was
a
a
real.
possibility, yeah. But the idea is, I mean, the you have like people have to understand the Shia population in Syria is minuscule. It is absolutely minuscule. We're talking about 12 or Shias, right?
Yeah.
But if we're the thing about them, about the Iranians, is that they lumped the Alawis into the Shia camp.
Well,
Now
I think the Alawis can't you courted that
they did, but it was. But here's the thing,
information.
man. It's political because obviously
Yeah, it's a
it's
political alliance. And let just for anybody who's not well versed in all of these sects of Islam, the Twelver uh, Shia is the religion that's the dominant religion in Iran and the government of Iran, and also of Hezbollah in Lebanon.
they're the majority Shia group. They're the
Yeah,
biggest
they're
sect of Shias.
but Alawis are sort of an offshoot that happened sometime in the Middle Ages that for most of their history were not really, considered by the Shia to be part of them. And they didn't necessarily consider themselves Shia. They're a very small group, really, that are kind of, uh, they tried to be kind of secretive because uh, a lot of people considered them heretics.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote about them, saying that that they weren't didn't consider them Muslims. So I mean, the
Ibn
Sunnis didn't
Taymiyyah wanted to
definitely
kill
didn't.
anybody
Yeah, but like they didn't. I
at
mean,
some
but
point.
the Sunnis definitely didn't consider them Muslims, but the Shias didn't. Like the 12 or Shias, the mainstream Shias didn't
Yeah,
consider them Muslim either.
but they
So
are now the family that runs the mafia dictatorship that is the Syrian government is majority Alawi, which means it's a minority ruling a country that does not that historically hasn't seen them as basically co-religionists.
yeah, so
Uh,
Syria is I mean and is still a majority Sunni country. I mean, we have like there are a lot of religious groups, but the largest group in Syria is the Sunni Muslims. Like that is the biggest group.
yeah,
Um,
so
the
it's
the
also
Alawis
part
make
of
up. Hmm?
it's a part of the way the Alawis control the country is by giving all power positions to people who are Alawi,
So
right?
yeah, in the primarily in the military and intelligence sectors, definitely the Alawis. For the people who don't know, just a really brief overview. Like you had mentioned, they came about in the Middle Ages, um, and they they were they were discriminated against and oppressed severely by the majority Sunnis, right? So that's why the Alawis, their traditional homeland is like their heartlands are in the mountains. They've always stayed in the mountains to like escape from the oppression.
Yeah,
And
similar to
so
the
that
Druze, the Druze
very
in
similar to the
Lebanon.
Druze. Exactly, very similar to the Druze. So those guys, I mean, the Alawis, it was about 1,000 years of oppression that they suffered. It was horrible, horrible oppression. And so in the 20th century, the only way that they could really get out of their really deep poverty, so the situation that they were in the mountains, they were excluded from Syrian society, they were extremely poor, um, was through the military. They saw that as the only route, the only avenue that they could take, that in which they were allowed to essentially be in. And so many of them flooded in, and the Sunnis, especially like the urban Sunnis, they thought, sending our kids to join the military was not like this prestigious thing, so they left it to others. And so the Alawis eventually became so numerous in the military that they took over. Right, there was like a military coup. I mean, there were military coups going on in Syria since like the late 40s. But eventually, that's how the Assad family came to power. Hafiz al-Assad was a military officer in the Air Force, and then took power that way with a group of other Alawi officers. So, but then he took them out, and it was just him. So they make up about 10 to 15% of Syria's population. In the 80s, and we had talked about this a little bit before in another episode, in the 80s, when the war between Iraq and Iran was going on. So Iraq, Saddam Hussein's regime was also a Ba'athist regime. The Assad regime was a Ba'athist regime, but they were rivals, right? So the
Yeah, I mean, because
and
Ba'ath is a pretty loose term. You know what I mean?
it is. It's an Arab nationalist movement, but it's yeah. I mean,
It's different in
it's
every
one that
country.
right, but it was co-opted by, in a lot of cases, by the military officers in a bunch of
Yeah.
countries, and so it wasn't. It was really just a medium for these officers to take power and stay in power. So, Hafiz al-Assad was very fearful of the power that Saddam's regime had, its military power, and so
Mhm.
he knew that if Saddam Hussein wanted to take over Syria, he probably could. Like he had at one point probably like the 10th strongest army in the world. And so in the 80s, when the war was going on between Iraq and Iran, Syria sided with Iran because of this rivalry. And part of that, part of that strategy was to also gain some sort of religious recognition for the Alawis
Mhm.
by the mainstream Shias of Iran, the 12er Shias. And so they wanted that recognition, because obviously, like we had said, they saw themselves as being excluded and not viewed as Muslims. And that was one of the big things, one of the big sticking points in Syria during the 80s, when the Muslim Brotherhood rose up. And in the early 80s, actually, was there's this accusation that Syria's president, according to its constitution, had to be a Muslim. And Hafiz al-Assad was accused of not being a Muslim because he was Alawi. So there were all these different things,
Well, this is
but
where you get a Hama like siege,
mhm,
because there was a Sunni revolt in a city that then the national military totally besieged, and that happened with 1982.
82, yeah. They
Yeah,
say like 10, like maybe 20, 30,000 people were killed.
yeah.
But I
And
mean,
also,
to
to add another little like tidbit of context to that, this was also during the Lebanese civil war, where you
yes.
had Hezbollah in Lebanon that were tied to, and they're, of any group in the world, they are the most tied to the Iranian regime.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think there was also sort of a, Syrian sympathy and connection with Hezbollah in Lebanon, part of their
Well,
aggression to Israel and that kind of
man,
thing. You know what I mean? Like it's a
Syrians
network.
are Syrians are tricky, man. I'll tell you that. Like, because here's the thing. Um, so yes, they wanted that closeness with Iran, which happened in the late 80s.
Mhm.
Hezbollah was founded in the early 80s, but in the first few years of Hezbollah's existence, the Syrian military. So I actually looked this up. We were talking about this in another episode. Syria did actually go in and invade Lebanon in the late 70s, right?
Mm.
So it was a 30-year long occupation. The thing is, so when Hezbollah was established for the first few years, they were treated just like any other group in Lebanon. They were actually attacked by the Syrian military at some point.
It was Syrian
Um,
military was trying to take over, but I mean,
right.
and they were the Syrians were there, but they weren't in control of the country until like what, like 1990.
No, they were very much in control. The Syrian military. So, okay, where it was based was in the Ba'a, so eastern Lebanon,
Yeah.
right? The Ba'a Valley. But uh, anything that happened in Lebanon, politically, militarily, between the different militias, had to. It couldn't happen without the Syrian military's knowledge. And so any sort of decisions, any sort of truces, anything like that had to go by Syria. And this is, I mean, the only place, and I think I mentioned this, the only place where the Syrian military had trouble taking over, and I think they weren't actually able to take over, were the mountains in Zahle. So like those Christians, the Christians in Zahle, they're tough. They're really tough, but they held out. But anyways, it was only till the late 80s when they Hafiz al-Assad was like, all right, I need to create this strategic alliance with Iran, that came about. And then they created that Shia sympathy towards Hezbollah. But ultimately, it was these are just purely political moves, and the proof of that is that now, and we can fast forward and talk about what's going on the ground, kind of like between, like on a more, I guess, individual level. Like when you talk about just random people living in Syria, one of the things that is going on is that even when it comes to pro Assad regime loyalists, there is a lot of anger and a lot of frustration that's being directed towards Iran, and a lot, and the Shia militias. And so just earlier, a couple of days ago, I heard that there's a famous division, in like an elite division in the Syrian military, that's controlled by Bashar al-Assad's brother, Maher al-Assad, who and so like I think at some point there was a checkpoint, and there was a woman who is the wife of some Hezbollah, like some high-ranking Hezbollah operative, and she was trying to get into Sayyida Zainab, like the area where the Sayyida Zainab shrine is, and they wouldn't let her in. And not only that, the soldiers were very rude with her, and they were very insulting even towards Sayyida Zainab. These are Alawi soldiers, right? And so it gets to a point where I think that a lot of the loyalists have felt that Syria is no longer, it doesn't belong to them anymore. It belongs to the Iranians and to Hezbollah and to these Shia militiamen,
Mm.
who are essentially taking over in many ways. And so you hear about these clashes, and you hear about people from the Hezbollah side getting killed, or from the Iranian militias getting killed, as well as the Syrian side. So like these guys are supposed to be tight, right? But there's a lot of infighting going on too. Um, so yeah, it's the Alawis. What's interesting about them, especially within the context of the Assad regime, is that for the last like I don't know 50, 60 years, a lot of the thinking, the political thinking, has been secular, which is primarily Ba'athist approach, and it works very well with Alawi religious identity. In that most Alawis are not aware. It's a secretive religion. You have to be initiated. You have to be of a certain age, and you have to be a male in order to be initiated to learn more about the faith. Right. So most Alawis, like Druze, for example,
Yeah,
aren't.
outsiders don't really know exactly even what their theology is completely.
No, no. And so most Alawis are not religious, right? Like it's a cultural religious identity, but it's not. There isn't a an open and deep practice. So secularism works very well
Well,
with that kind
secularism
of.